Thank you, everyone, for joining. I am here with Professor Susan Stryker, the award winning scholar and filmmaker, and currently a visiting professor at Yale University. She directed what I assigned the other day, the Emmy winning documentary Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, which you can access for free on YouTube. I have the link on our website at quarantini.lgbt. Professor Stryker, thank you so much for joining me today. You said you're in San Francisco?
That is correct. And I also want to give a shout out to my co-director, Victor Silverman, who we both co-directed, co-wrote, and co-produced Screaming Queens. But thank you so much for pushing it to your audience. I'm honored.
Oh no, well thank you for making it and for joining us. And I think I just rewatched it, and one thing I love that you don't get often in historical documentaries is kind of the I story, kind of the background behind how you got involved in the research, and it showed you in the archives. And as a historian, I'm always curious on how you first stumbled upon the story of Compton's Cafeteria, and also, even before that, how you became interested in trans history to begin with.
Mhm. Well, I've always been interested in history. That's what I did my PhD in, although it wasn't in trans history, per se. I mean, I've always been interested in questions about the historicity of identity and how new identity categories emerge and how they are used to organize social life, as well as kind of like our own sense of who we are. So like that was an ongoing interest of mine, but it didn't really seem possible when I was in grad school back in the 1980s, long time ago, to do work on trans history. It sort of didn't really exist as a field or even as a viable dissertation topic at that time. But when I was I always knew that I was trans. I wasn't always sure what I would do about it. It's like it was a decision-making process, but it was in my 20s when I was in grad school that I, decided that, yeah, this is what I need to do for myself. And I'll just say that employment discrimination and social stigma directed at trans people is real. And that there was just very little chance for me to be, hired as an academic historian as an out trans person, at the time that I was transitioning and going out into the job market. So, I had what I called my 7-year unpaid internship in doing transgender history. I did a lot of volunteer work. I, taught myself a whole new field of history. I did a lot of original research of my own. Um, and my base of operations for doing that, for working as a kind of a community-based historian uncovering trans history, was at an organization now known as the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco, which you see in the film Screaming Queens. I started there as a volunteer. I became a member of the board of directors. And over time, I eventually became the first paid executive director of the organization. So I was involved with them for about 12 years, and had kind of helped the organization grow, along with many other people. It's quite a community-based effort. But it's like my day job was basically being in this archive and just having the nerdy historian pleasure of just reading everything that came in, of scanning decades of gay and lesbian and some bi and trans material, like periodical publications and zines and people's personal papers. And I just always kind of kept my own little file and my own notes of anything trans related that I came across. And I had come across some mention of the Compton's Cafeteria riot pretty early on, like back in the early 90s sometime. But I didn't know that much about it, and I just I thought, oh, well, this sounds pretty cool. Like a riot that sounds kind of like the Stonewall riots, except, yeah, maybe smaller, definitely had trans people involved, took place earlier, West Coast, not East Coast. This would be an interesting story to try to figure out. And so, I just collected little bits and pieces of the puzzle. And over time, I mean, over the course of about 6 or 7 years, I feel like I was able to pull together a coherent story about what happened. Um, and then I decided to make a film about it. There was, as I mentioned, it's like the film was actually made by Victor Silverman as well as by me. He's a professor, history professor down at Pomona College in Southern California. And Victor was a really good grad school buddy of mine. It's like we've been friends for decades and decades. And about the time that I was thinking, hey, this Compton's Cafeteria story that I have found out about, I think I might like to make a documentary film about it. Victor happened to be on sabbatical that year, and he called me up and said, "Hey, I've been thinking about. I don't know if I want to be a history professor. I want to make film. It's like, do you want to write a screenplay with me?" And I said, "Well, maybe. It's like that sounds fun, but I'm actually like putting together an application for a fellowship that if I get, I want to use to make a documentary film." He's going like, I don't want to make documentary film. I want to do like a, feature fiction film. I said, well, tell you what, if I get the money, let's work on this documentary film together. And if I don't get it, sure, let's write a screenplay on spec together. That'll be fun. Uh, and I got the money, and Victor was just a dream to work with. So, even though a lot of the historical research that went into the film came out of my own personal work, it's like there's a difference between figuring out the historical story and then doing the actual work of making the film. And, it took a whole different set of skills. We had to find not just the historical narrative, but we had to find the archival footage, that we could use to tell the story. And anyway, it was just a dream to work with a good friend on doing a project that helped both of us become filmmakers and help put out a story in the public realm that I just think is a kind of a kick-ass story.
Oh, so kick
It was
ass.
a story to find. And it's been like the honor of my life to be able to like tell that story in public and have it get out there and have knowledge about it circulate.
Yeah, and as a resident of Los Angeles, I'm lucky enough to have the One Archives just down the
Yeah,
road.
another amazing resource.
Right, and I don't think people who aren't trained historians realize how easy it is to access the collections. Like if you want to see, the very first edition of The Advocate, then you can go and flip through it and sit there and see some of these little tidbits of history that has not been told yet and that are all just kind of waiting for people like you to tell the stories. So if anyone's listening, the archives are amazing. Hopefully they'll open up back up soon, but so much of it is digitized as well. But for people who may not have seen the film yet, can you give us a little bit of a teaser as to what, we mentioned, it's a kind of almost like a mini Stonewall 3 years before Stonewall itself. What was the context of that revolt?
Well, as you were just saying, the first mention that I found of this riot, it was written in 1972. It was actually in the centerfold of the first gay pride parade in San Francisco, centerfold program. And, it basically said, hey, we're gathering here to, celebrate, the resistance at Stonewall, but don't forget that, 3 years earlier in San Francisco, it's like, as it said at the time, drag queens rose up angry at the constant harassment by the police. It took place at a place called Compton's Cafeteria at the corner of Turk and Taylor, where the police were coming in to, do their usual job of hassling, all the queer kids who were hanging out there late at night. But, this time, there was resistance when a a cop tried to arrest one of the queens. She threw her coffee in his face, and this whole, sort of riot erupted, and they smashed out the windows of this place called Compton's Cafeteria. Um, Police backup poured in, patrons poured out into the streets. And as this, one description that I found said, General Havoc was raised that night in the Tenderloin, which is the name of the neighborhood where the riot took place. So, that was a great story, but it was written, 7 years after the fact, 6 years after the fact. And I wondered, it's like, is it exaggerated? Is it basically some kind of like, East Coast, West Coast rivalry thing? It's like, yeah, New York, we got your Stonewall right here. Been there, done that first. San Francisco always gets there before New York, like that kind of thing. And it just took me a while to actually verify that description actually pretty accurately described what happened on, one August night in 1966. We don't have an exact date for it. Some circumstantial evidence says it's probably the third Saturday in the month, but we don't know for sure. Yeah, that's what the film is about. Because I'm an historian, it's like I wanted to tell not just the story of the riot itself, but it's like what fed into it, like what caused these people one night to just, like they've been, abused by the cops their whole lives, as trans women and hustlers and, street kids. And it's like, why this one night? So part of the film is not just about recounting what happened in the riot, but trying to paint the backstory, both in terms of what was life like for trans women in the mid 1960s, and why did they live in the Tenderloin, and what was going on in the city at that time that contributed to this like act of spontaneous resistance. And, as in the case with most spontaneous acts of mass resistance, it's like there's a long fuse, that has to do with, interlocking kinds of social oppressions. And that's what we try to get at in the film, like talking about, transphobic discrimination in employment and housing, and the importance of people, doing survival sex work, and police violence directed against marginalized communities, often communities of color, lack of access to healthcare, the housing crisis, urban renewal and redevelopment, mobilizations against the war, as this is in the Vietnam War era. So there were all kinds of things that fed into this particular moment. And, I have to say, I think we did a pretty good job of weaving, all of the different threads of civil rights activism and anti-poverty mobilizations, into this little story. There was a little riot, involving, dozens or maybe 100 or so people, one night, one corner in a poor neighborhood in San Francisco. But to use that to tell this broader story about the 60s, about queer life, about trans people, about resistance, it's like that was what made it such a rewarding story to.
Yeah, and I think one of the more surprising things, as someone, I study more East Coast homophile activism, and so my knowledge of West Coast events and activism is more limited. So when I first watched the film, I was surprised by, even though it was a small act of resistance, the ripple effects within San Francisco and within the trans community, especially with Stanford getting involved. And you start to see what you talk about, the evolution of trans identity. So what does the film, would you say, tell us, or what lessons can we learn from this story of resistance, and how, events like these affect history?
Hmm. I think the larger takeaway point for me is that when people experience some kind of social oppression or structural violence is being directed at them, we when we're in those positions, we use whatever strength we have to survive that oppression. Um, if you believe that it can't change, right? Just like that, your strength goes into just like continuing to take your next breath. Um, but if you catch this glimpse, this glimmer that circumstances can actually change, it's like that's when all of that like strength that you've used to survive actually gets channeled into something that can change the circumstances that you live in. And so for me, part of telling the story was, even though it's like at some level it was kind of like a flash in the pan, like it happened, there was some change, things got bad again, people forgot about it. But just to say, you know what, this thing actually happened, it made a difference, and we can actually collectively change the circumstances of our lives. And I think, I mean, everything for the past month has been about, the coronavirus. But I think it's important to remember, like in this moment where, I mean, we literally don't have a clue what's going to happen next week, next month, 2 months from now. I mean, we know the pandemic is bad, like historically unprecedentedly bad in living memory, but we don't yet know what the economic and social and political fallout of this is going to be. It's like it is off the charts huge. But in this moment where things have changed in a way that could not have been anticipated 6 months ago, 3 months ago, um, this is the moment for people to envision what a different world order can actually look like. We have learned so much in the past month, the past 2 weeks. It's like rent, jobs, what are those, right? Just like, right? How are frontline workers in the healthcare and food production and delivery, transportation industries? It's like, how are they changing the way they do what they do? How is everybody else surviving? It's like work means something different than it did a month ago. Um, what's going to happen to capitalism? Is it going to get more vicious, or is it going to break and something else, starts to fill in the cracks? We don't know. It's like, but this is the moment, I think, to just be like really inspired to for people to kind of like try their wings to like imagine how deeply things can be different than they have been. And in this moment where like change is happening, what kind of change can we make possible? And not just like freak out because things are bad, but it's like as things crumble, what do we build in its place? It's like going back isn't good enough. And so, like, hear stories of like really marginalized people just being fierce and like insisting on their right to live and take up space and breathe and be on the sidewalk, buy a cup of coffee. To me, like that's a good story to
Yeah.
hear right now.
Yeah, and especially now, I think the idea of, we will have to rebuild and maybe we can make a more just society for ourselves, but at the same time being vigilant about, historically in times of emergency and panic and fear, that's when, you see some of the gravest injustices throughout society, throughout history. And so some of the news, I know today we talked, today we're going to put this out on Wednesday, but Tuesday was the Trans Day of Visibility, which came literally the day after trans children in Idaho are under attack essentially, and also the governor signed two pieces of legislation that were in this time of crisis for inexplicably going after trans citizens. So I'm wondering, on this holiday, on this day of visibility, why are days like this important?
Yeah, well, I would want to go even bigger than just trans visibility. It's like I think you were so right in saying that, like in states of emergency, people in power often try to extend their power in the name of the emergency. I think about what Viktor Orban has done in Hungary. Like basically, it's like the government just said you have unlimited powers and can disband the government, and it's like full on Berlin 1933, levels of anti-democratic authoritarian regime, installing itself. So, I don't want to limit the conversation just to trans issues. It's like, yes, it's like in this moment, people who are transphobic or anti-queer or, like have some hostility or animus, against trans folks. It's like, yeah, they're certainly using this moment to push an agenda, just like they're using this moment to try to get rid of abortion services, in Texas and Alabama, so like, oh, it's a non-essential, medical procedure. So, we have to be vigilant, because people are going to be trying stuff. They are trying stuff. And yet, there is this crack, there is an opening. I think the real question will be like, how well do people stay mobilized to push for the kind of social vision that they have? Like I look at Instacart workers and warehouse workers at Amazon saying like, no, like we're actually putting our lives on the line to like bring food and necessities to people. And yeah, we're not gonna like take the bad behavior. It's like we're on strike, and the only thing that will change reactionary attempts by certain politicians or parts of the government is when the people rise up against it. It's like when you literally become ungovernable. It's just like it's like become ungovernable and envision the kind of government or lack thereof, that you want. You know,
Do you have any advice for, people like me, a cis white gay guy who, wants to help the people in our community who are more marginalized, maybe don't have the comfort of a home during this time or a stable income? What can we do in order to help that part of our community?
Okay, well, I would say, first of all, always it's like listen to the people who are most impacted and affected by a particular injustice and get out of the way and let them lead. And when you hear what they're saying they need, it's like bring whatever resources you have that you can spare to like turn over, to those efforts. So, it's like, are you seeing people build like mutual aid networks? Just like don't have some opinion about like what counts as mutual aid for them. It's like if that's a community that you care about and want to support, turn over what resources you have. It's like use Venmo and PayPal. If you can volunteer doing something that helps that community, whether it's like sewing masks at home or of a place where there's like an empty house that somebody can live in. Just to each according to their abilities, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs, and let the people most affected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Well, my very last question is, do you have any suggestions for resources of people who might be more interested in trans history or resistance? I know I have this, which I highly recommend for everyone.
Yeah.
Transgender History by.
Yeah, so it's a transgender history book that I wrote. It's intended to be a, kind of a easy, introductory, down and dirty book on, just sort of a quick general introduction to the topic of trans history, mostly in North America, mostly in the 20th century. Other books that I would recommend reading, I think Dean Spade's book, Normal Life, which talks about the kinds of administrative violence that trans people can experience in a really sort of routine way, like through the routine operations of bureaucracy and state administrative practices and, within social institutions like prisons and schools and whatnot, how trans people can experience violence in those contexts. That's a good book to look at. There's so many. It's like I've got a bookshelf that I can see right over there with like hundreds of books on it, 90% of which could be useful to read in this moment. It's hard to, to think of them all off the top of my head. Yeah, so maybe I'll just stop. I'll just stop with that, and say, yeah, just encourage your viewers to like prowl around on the internet and find places to plug in, whether it's like I said, giving resources to mutual aid networks or, volunteering in some way to support, healthcare workers, just doing whatever it is that you can do, keeping yourself safe, healthy, investing in the networks right around you. Kind of hate to use that word invest, but like put your energy into things that sustain the world around you. And don't forget that resistance is possible and change sometimes comes.
Yeah, and hopefully we can use this opportunity to really, like you said, I love the idea of imagining what could take the place of what is falling right now and what we can rebuild. So thank you so much. This has been so illuminating. And again, what's that?
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, well, thank you. And of course, Screaming Queens, the Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. I have the link on our website. It's available for free on YouTube. A wonderful story, and I think the perfect introduction to a really important part of our history. Professor Stryker, thank you again for joining, and stay healthy, and hope to see you in person soon.
Hope so. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.